Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's exciting discussion. Before we proceed, I want to start with a quote from a book by Mariame Kaba. "We do this till we free us" is her book. And the quote is, "If we want to get rid of patriarchy, we have to get rid of punishment." Now I'd like to introduce tonight's guest, Judith Levine, who is a journalist about sex, gender, feminism, justice, and emotions in politics. She's a co-founder of the National Writers Union, a board member for the National Center of Reason and Justice, ACLU, and many others. She's an author of 5 books. And she has co-authored a book with Erica Miners, which is called The Feminist and the Sex Offender. And together they published a blog called A Sex Offender's Human in 2016. And we welcome her tonight. Thank you for being here, Judith.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So I do want to talk about your latest book, The Feminist and the Sex Offender. This is a very profound book, and I think it's a very important discussion that we'll be having about bias in everyday and higher education. You know, I took sociology of feminism. I took several courses to do with feminism in higher education. And I really think that anyone taking those courses, and really anyone in general, can benefit from this book. And one quote that really struck me is, "At its most radical, feminism is a challenge not just to the domination of women or queer people, but it's the opposition of all forms of justice. Feminism is also a vision of a world in which freedom from violence is not an end in itself, but rather an atmosphere in which all can flourish." So let me ask you, Judith, what does feminism mean to you? And why is that word such a threatening word to some people?
That's a very big question to start with. Feminism to me is a way of thinking about the world that envisions a society, or all societies, without domination on the basis of gender, ability, race, class. In fact, for me, a vision of feminism is one in which we don't necessarily think of each other, you know, only in those categories, as important as those categories are in many ways. And the other part of feminism to me is that you began with this wonderful quote from Mariame Kaba, which we also have in our book. Feminism envisions a world in which we do not use violence in order to get what we want, solve problems, resolve conflict, because that is a masculinist, that is an ideology that says might makes right. Feminism is really the opposite of that ideology.
Beautiful. I remember taking a class on feminist lit and talking a lot about that framework and that vision. And I wish we'd had your book in that class. I know people often look at the word feminism and have a certain idea of what that means, but I love the way that you've just described feminism and the vision of feminism.
You know, JT, I think it's probably more accurate to talk about feminisms in the plural, because feminism is not a monolithic movement. And I think what we might be talking about today is one of the fissures, one of the splits in feminism are between those people who critics would call carceral feminists. That is, people who would solve the problem of violence with more violence, with punishment, with incarceration, with surveillance. And then on the other side are the kinds of feminism that I was just talking about. And then of course, you know, there are, and that kind could be called an abolition feminism. That is a feminism that wants to get rid of those kinds of punitive institutions and punitive ways of thinking. And then of course there are, there are African-American feminisms, there are Arab feminisms, there are Asian, Japanese feminisms. I mean, there are international, global feminisms, local feminisms. And of course, things keep moving. They keep changing, which is a good thing.
Wonderful, yes. And I want to talk more about that, I think, as we go on tonight. And I think, like you said, it's important to recognize that intersectionality and how that impacts American society. Intersectionality being a term that was popularized by Kimberly Crenshaw in her book, Critical Race Theory. An amazing book. I highly recommend that everyone read that. So my question to you is, how can we transform our understanding of intersectionality in a white-dominated society, which is obviously well known for denying economic equality and racism? And in your words, white supremacy that damages solidarity and efficacy. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and how that relates to intersectionality?
What intersectionality means, as you suggested, JT, is that everyone has lots of parts of them. You're not just a woman, you're not just a Black person, you're not just a person with disabilities. You are, a person, you're a white man who was born in, I don't know where, Detroit or someplace. You grew up with two siblings, whatever it is. You came from a family, a working class family, middle class family, a poor family. And so that we all come to the world from a place. Everyone is situated in the world somewhere. And all of these different parts that we are, all of these different, elements of ourselves, put us in a position, as Kimberly Crenshaw said, at the intersection of all of those things. And, sometimes I think of myself as a woman. I'm in some situations in which being a woman is the main thing I am. Then there are other times in which I lived part of the time in a small town, and I just read in our local paper that there was somebody scrawled an anti-Semitic, swear word on somebody else's door, on the door of a Jew. And in that moment, I feel pain as a Jew. Other times I don't feel like a Jew at all. It's not what's foremost in my identity or my thoughts or in the position from which I'm approaching the world. White supremacy presumes that there is one single identity, and it often goes along with masculine, male, heteronormative, we say heterosexual, male, able-bodied, white, that is the supreme, best, and should be the only, dominating force in the world. And what that means, of course, is that everybody else is going to fall beneath the boots of, of those white supreme beings. It's at the moment an ideology movement that's in defense. It's defending itself because the world is changing, because the United States is changing, because there are many more people of color, because some cities are majority minority, and all of us rabble are trying to, make our voices heard. And power is a limited quantity. Somebody loses power, somebody gains power. You said before, why are people so threatened by feminism? It's because not everybody wins. There are ways in which men will win from feminism, but there are also ways in which some people will lose power when others gain power.
Absolutely. And people today deny that white supremacy is a threat as well, especially here in America. They really want to hold on to that power, and they'll do anything to keep it. Yeah. For example, in Virginia, we just had a very important vote. And one statistic I saw was that white women who are not college educated overwhelmingly supported that philosophy, and that they don't believe in teaching CRT, or what they believe is CRT. And it's this group, this white, not college educated women who are in support of that. And you see that the opposite with college educated women. So anyway, we had a big vote. We didn't get what we wanted. So the next 4 years will be quite a challenge.
We hope it's only the next 4.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we'll keep fighting the good fight. We're not giving up. So you also wrote a chapter, I believe the chapter was Men Facing Masculinity, or Men Face Masculinity. And you wrote, I'll quote you, "It can be tough to challenge male violence within a patriarchy without denouncing patriarchal institutions or subcultures." I have another quote here by Quentin or Q Wolcott. They say, "Like whiteness and white supremacy, male privilege is invisible. Misogynistic attitudes are invisible. Patriarchy is not just a spot on the page, it's a whole page." So my question for you is, do you have any thoughts on how people can dismantle the patriarchal system, which is a huge part of toxic masculinity and white supremacy, along with these challenges that come with it, and bullying prevention, mental health awareness?
JT, your questions are way too big. My answer is, don't ask me. If I knew, if only I knew. You know, it's not going to happen all at once. You know, there's just, everyone has to sort of choose the place that they come to this problem from. The place that I come to it from is, one of the places is in trying to attack this, you know, punitive system that we have, this carceral system, one that thinks that we can solve the problems of violence by adding to the violence. That to me, you know, if we actually could figure out ways to deal with conflict, because conflict is natural, there's always conflict. If we could figure out ways, both in our interpersonal relationships, within our families, within our communities, within our country, without violence, and among countries and between countries, we would go a long way toward dismantling this dominating system, which has to hold itself up with violence. I mean, we see this in authoritarian countries, and we see it now in what's going on in the United States. Just a huge amount of violence. I don't know if you've been watching the Rittenhouse trial. Just a, you know, more and more, the idea that you would walk into the street with an automatic weapon and shoot people down is becoming more and more normalized, you know, that it's okay to carry guns. It's okay to shoot people. This is the way we should solve our problems. In fact, even the guy who survived Rittenhouse's shooting was carrying a gun himself. That certainly belies this idea that a good guy with a gun is gonna, you know, gonna bring down the bad guy with the gun. The gun being in that picture, you know, someone is gonna get hurt or killed.
You know, it's interesting. We see Rittenhouse being brought to trial, and the same, you know, in 2021, the same thing continues to happen. Yeah, it's very sad.
You know, I was talking to somebody about this today. If you really have an abolitionist viewpoint, it's really challenged when somebody like Kyle Rittenhouse comes along, because, you know, it's very understandable to feel such rage at a person like that, that you just want to get back at them. You just want your vengeance. You want that person to be harmed as much as the harm that he did. So, like, how do we interrupt that? You know, how do we react to a person like Kyle Rittenhouse? I think the only way to be able to hold in our minds these two things, this awful act that this person has done on one hand, and then the desire for ways of solving conflict that do not involve violence. The only way to do that, I think, is to try to understand the political atmosphere, the class atmosphere, and so on, that produces a Kyle Rittenhouse. I mean, he wasn't born as a baby, you know, with an AK in his hands, you know. He became something. He became something in Trumpism. He became something wherever he grew up, you know. And so we can change that by bringing kids up differently, by making sure that everybody has enough. People don't feel, you know, resentful of others. So that's the only way to not feel like, okay, you know, lock him up for the rest of his life or kill him, you know. It's not bad to feel that anger. I mean, we feel those feelings. The feelings are not bad. It's, you know, what do we do with those feelings?
And I think communication is such an important part of that too. You know, having empathy, coming to an understanding with people who are different, rather than just writing people off. I think continuing that conversation and communication is so important. I see so many situations where communication is not happening, especially as a deaf person. That's something that really impacts me, is when people don't take that time.
Absolutely.
So this term of other children, I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. In your book, you say, in white American culture, non-white children are not really children. They're small and potentially bad adults in need of correction, not protection. And a large body of research shows that authorities see Black children as more culpable of crimes, as possessing adult intent and capacity, and thus more deserving of harsh punishment than their white peers. Sadly, this is true. Why is this still a problem?
Well, first of all, I want to just clarify, it's not that Black children are those things, it's Black children are seen as those things, not really children, not innocent. You know, a great deal of our carceral system, and in particular the sex offender registry and all of the laws and restrictions that we have of people who have convictions, sex-related convictions, is all built around the protection of children. And the protection of children assumes that there is this creature called the innocent child, the child who has never done anything wrong, who is, you know, who's pure. And the innocence, the innocent child, is assumed to be white. That's part of the definition. Even if we don't say it, that's part of the vision, that's part of the construction of the innocent child. Children of color, you see that they're kicked out of school much more than, you know, than white children. You know, a kid like Michael Brown can be shot by a cop because he sees him as larger than life and like a superhero. Bullets won't stop him. And so those children who are also children, who are also in need of protection, are much more seen as perpetrators than victims of harm, or potentially, you know, potential harm doers. And you're right that you know, educators, authorities, white people in general look at Black children in schools, you know, maybe when they're 3 or 4, they're cute. And then as soon as they begin to grow up just a little bit, those teachers, authorities, and so on begin to see any mischief that they do, or any resistance that they have, or any unhappiness, or, you know, as criminal. And therefore they need to be corrected. They need to be punished. They need to be put into a system of some sort. And furthermore, their parents need to be watched over. Their parents are blamed for the wrongdoing, supposed wrongdoing of their children. So yes, so this idea of innocence is just, it's inextricably bound to whiteness.
I think that same thing happens to deaf children, especially deaf BIPOC children.
Yeah,
they're often forgotten. They're viewed as stupid, subhuman. They're oppressed through racism, through autism. because hearing culture, being the majority culture, tells you that what you're doing is wrong. You're not deserving of protection. They're rejected, they're dehumanized, they're criminalized. And I think I wanted to share this book with you, Understanding Deaf Culture.
And who's the author?
The author is Patty Ladd. And on page 92, I'll quote him. He says, encouraged a discourse of deaf people as human beings suffering from a lack of impairment, this deficit model. And that's how deaf children are seen, as having a deficit. And from your book, you said, so radical is the marginalization of the large and varied category of persons labeled sex offenders that their existence has been called a social death, a term sociologist Orlando Patterson used to describe slavery. Can you give an example of this social death and why, and vigilantism and how that fits in, and how that can be viewed as a form of slavery or dehumanization?
Well, it's not a form of slavery. Orlando Patterson was speaking about the radical dehumanization of enslaved people, that they were not human. And so that's it. They were just outside of the community of human beings. So this idea, this category, the sex offender, which is a very vast category of people, young people who have consensual sex with other young people, up to people who have committed violent rape, and everything in between. The sex offender is the person who we are allowed to do anything we want to forever. Anything that they have done is unforgivable. There's something congenital about that person. There's something built into that person, into that person's personality, their body, that they will never be cured of. And therefore they need to be kept under supervision, under surveillance, on a registry. They have to check in every month to say, if they get a new car or take a class or change their password on their computer. There seems to be really nothing that the courts have found to be cruel and unusual punishment if the punished person is a so-called sex offender. In fact, I've been looking at these laws. There's now a whole movement in the country to expunge the criminal records of people who have everything from misdemeanors up to even felonies after a certain time without any further commission of a crime. But in every single one of these laws, every single one, and every single criminal justice reform as well, right off the top, except for sex offenders. That's in fact, even before there's a negotiation, before there's even like trading at the table, the sex offender is excluded from all criminal justice reforms. And what that means is that the so-called sex offender is irredeemable, doesn't deserve to be thought of as a person, doesn't deserve to have rights ever for the rest of usually his life. We've actually begun to make headway around the death penalty, to say that the state should not be allowed to execute anyone, no matter what they have done, no matter how heinous their crime. And yet this thing, the sex offender, has held on now for decades. It's now like 4 decades since the beginning of this panic. That is the one kind of person, even if that person is considered a person, who is excluded from the possibility of forgiveness, redemption, change, rights, and anything. So, and of course, the sex offender is a scapegoat for so many of the social anxieties we have. If we could just control that person, then everything else will be clean and clear. Children will be safe. Whereas we know that the kinds of things that really afflict children, poverty, lack of education, lack of time to have pleasure, an environment, global warming, all of these things. These are the things that really war, violence. These are the things that really threaten women, threaten children. That's what we need to protect children from, not this mythic monster, you know, crouching in the bushes called the sex offender.
Yeah, I mean, myself, I've often been labeled as a monster. And it hurts, you know, it hurts. It often comes from fear, you know, so once someone is labeled a sex offender and once they're convicted, they face that social death because of fear. Once, you know, and language really causes that labeling and that fear, rather than someone being called a sex offender or a registered citizen, person with sex offenses. You know, what is the best term to use to avoid some of these labeling? You know, well, if we're to live in a society without labels, how can we help these citizens not have sex offender tattooed across their forehead?
Well, part of the etiquette in the anti-carceral movement and the abolitionist movement is that you don't ask people what they did. You know, a person who's incarcerated, you don't say to them, so what are you in for? The reason for this is A, maybe they didn't do the thing that they're in for. That's possible, that they're innocent. But the other thing is that we don't want to use the label that the state assigns to people. You know, we're not the worst thing that we ever did. You know, everyone makes mistakes. Everyone harms. Everyone is harmed. That's a principle of restorative justice. We all have done harm, and we all have suffered harm. And so, you know, to me, you're JT. That's who you are. You're a guy who, I don't know what you do for a living, but you have this radio show. And if I knew you better, I would know a lot more things about you. And one thing is that you were convicted of some offense. I'm not going to ask you what it is, some time ago. But you seem to be like living a peaceful life. And so, you know, I don't call, like, I know people who have done very violent crimes, people who have even killed people. I don't talk about the person as a murderer. I talk about them as whatever their name is. And if they harm me, if they do something, well, that's the thing I want to hold them responsible for. It's not that people don't get held accountable for the things they do, but you don't have to be held accountable for the rest of your life. You know, you change, you take responsibility, and hopefully the community is then able to embrace you again, you know, and not banish you from humanity.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, in the last 25 years, it's been a very tough journey with lots of obstacles. You know, I've suffered from a lot of this labeling and bullying and hate. I've been threatened. And I do hope that society starts to forgive. I don't see that happening right now, but, you know, all I see is people reminding others of what I have done, and that follows me for the rest of my life. It doesn't matter what other good things I've done in my life. That's my label forever.
Yeah. You know, I've spent many, many decades trying to figure out, you know, with other people, what to do about this. And, you know, in a certain way, it's surprising because most moral panics blow over after a while, you know. This one has been going on for a really long time. It seems to just be holding on. And my latest theory is that we have built up such a huge body of laws and legal precedent that you'd have to dismantle each one of those in order to begin. You know, you have to get rid of the sex offender registry, number one, because that's the thing that labels you. That's the thing that doesn't let you get a job or live in a place or, you know, have your family or, you know, all of these other things, travel, so on. And those are the things that get people back on their feet. I mean, it's true that anybody who has a felony conviction has all of these collateral consequences. It's very, very hard for anyone coming out of prison to, you know, to have a life. But if you have this, you know, scarlet A tattooed to your forehead or S, as you say, it's, you know, in addition to all of the hatred that you get pushed at you, there's the very depression and demoralization of not being able to get up and, you know, get going and just do your life and do the things that you enjoy and make a living and, you know, have a family, all of the kinds of normal everyday things that people want to do. And that also the kinds of things that if you actually did commit some kind of offense, the kinds of things that prevent you from doing that again, because you have a fulfilling life. You know, I think, and we were talking before about, you know, labels and intersectional stuff and all that. I mean, I really think the only way that we will slowly get rid of this is one by one, you know, humanizing. I mean, I hate that word because it sort of means like the person wasn't human before, but introducing, familiarizing, you know, people with these people who are called sex offenders who turn out to be really just like everybody else. I do think that it's really important for us to not pass laws that exclude sex offenders, because no one is ever going to come along and say, okay, let's include them now. That's not going to happen. So we shouldn't pass laws that we're going to have to undo in the future. You know, I really admire people who come out and say publicly, I'm on the sex offender registry. It's very courageous. It sets you up for even more abuse than you're already getting. And yet, frankly, I think it's the only way that it's going to happen. I could talk about it till I'm blue in the face, but only when they meet you, GAT, a regular guy. Will people stop fearing so much? I think that's what it is.
I think part of the problem too is that, you know, through social media, through the internet, once someone hears that someone is a sex offender, they just blast them. You know, there's no one-on-one human interaction. And so it's so easy to talk about someone through an electronic way without having that human conversation.
And that's a problem. It's a general problem, right? That when we're not actually having conversations with the person with a face, you know, with a voice, we never, you know, it's much easier to be hideous to somebody else if you're just typing it on your keyboard, you know. You know, people have really been disinhibited from, you know, giving, you know, threatening people. Death threats are like just saying, you know, go soak your head or something. It was like everybody just tosses off death threats to other people. On one hand, they've sort of lost their meaning. On the other hand, they're scary every time because who knows when it's going to be real. So, you know, I just think that somehow we need to reestablish.
Yeah, I've experienced those death threats through the internet. They are terrifying.
Yeah, I've gotten them too.
Yeah, actually just somebody showed up at my house and it was another deaf person. And they said they found me through the sex offender registry and they showed up at my house. And so, you know, that's something I really struggle with, is having those one-on-one conversations to show people who I am, you know, that, you know, I'm not just a sex offender. And so having those opportunities to have conversations is difficult. But I've been threatened with violence. I've had death threats. About 25 years ago, actually, my mom, who just passed away 3 months ago, she was looking at the internet and she saw my picture on the internet. And I remember looking at her, watching her look at this picture and just dissolve into tears. And that, you know, I thought that was the worst time of my life. And that registry 25 years later is still making my life hell.
And I think the thing that you're saying now is that it doesn't hurt just the person who's on the registry, but their family, their friends, the people they love, their children. There's just, you know, reverberations that go further and further out to which is a reason that people then start to reject you, right? They don't want to be harmed in that way. Or just, you know, your mother is your mother, you know, and you're lucky that your mother loved you and stood by you. But even people's families start to reject them because they can't live with it. You know, it's just too hard to, you know, it's too scary to have their children threatened, you know, to have elderly people threatened because their son, you know, is on the registry. And so that also makes the registrant feel even worse. But somehow they're bringing misery upon the people that they love the most, as if it were their fault.
Yep, exactly that. And this public shaming, this cyberbullying, cyber lynching, cyber hate, conspiracy theories, you know, people perpetuate this violence. When do you, and these hate crimes, these racist hate crimes, oftentimes, you know, a few years ago, I read an article about a kid who is now 21, and this is in Ohio. And this case just actually went to court. He got $17.5 million. And the situation's a very sad story. When this kid was 18 years old, he had a girlfriend who was 16. They had consensual sex and filmed themselves consensually. He was put into jail. He was on the sex offender registry. And apparently some guards found out what he was in jail for. And so they broke his spine, broke him physically, and laughed about it, and were proud that they had hurt this sex offender. And there were no charges against them, no punishment for them. But this kid is now paralyzed. And his family has to deal with this. He's 21 years old now. This happened when he was 18. But things like that, you know, people, they don't get punished for that. They do this harm to this kid who was just an 18-year-old kid with a girlfriend who was younger than him. And he now has to live with paralysis for the rest of his life. And they just get away with it. And I know you wrote this blog, Are Sex Offenders Human? This piece that you wrote in 2016. Can you speak a little bit about that?
It was a long time ago. I don't really remember what it said. I mean, I think we were talking about some films and, you know, this question that I just said before about humanizing, you know, as if the person were not human to begin with. I mean, I think we were just talking about the, you know, the images of the sex offender as if they, you know, were not human. That this is always it's always a question, you know, is this person human? Even when we've been able to see, you know, people who have done every other kind of offense, frankly, you know, as human. So yeah, as I said, I can't, it was like, I don't even really remember where we published it, but people can Google it. And Erica's name is spelled M-E-I-N-E-R-S.
Thank you. Yes, I highly suggest everybody who is watching, Google and read that article. Now, just a few days ago, the Department of Justice awarded more than $21 million for the prevention and response to hate crimes. In your view, should society be taught how to prevent hate crimes, specifically targeting registrants? And is vigilante justice considered a hate crime? You know, there are more and more documented killings of registrants, and the people who do the killing are seen as heroes. Is there a code of silence, perhaps? You know, how do you view this?
I don't really want to get into this. I'm not a big fan of hate crimes legislation, frankly, because I don't really like the state defining what's hate. You know, the point that you're bringing up, like, you can't hate a sex offender. That doesn't exist. You know, you're just giving them what they deserve. So, you know, some things that I might consider hateful, whoever's in power doesn't, or whoever wrote the law. You know, what do we do? you know, we started out talking about like, what do we do about violence? We try not to add to it. You know, when you say that, you know, they don't, I think, you know, people have to be held accountable. Do we have to throw them in prison? I don't know. I mean, even like, you know, what do you do with people who commit violence as an agent of the state, such as the police or the you know, corrections officer in the prison guard? The state is responsible, you know, for that. The person is responsible himself as well. But, you know, I'm not really sure whether we, you know, who do we hold accountable there? Maybe both the person and the state. But it's, you know, it's not surprising that people would do that kind of harm to, you know, to so-called sex offenders, because the law, you know, has put people, you know, in it. They're a target. You know, they're in some states you have to put it on your door. You have to put it on you have a sign on your lawn. You know, the public registry, all of this other stuff. So it's not at all surprising that people do violence. In fact, as you suggested, that may be the inherent intention of the law, is that other people will enforce it, that other people will, you know, carry out the vengeance of the state personally as vigilantes. You know, we just have a law now in Texas that they've just deputized people to, you know, ruin the lives of anyone who has an abortion or anyone who helps that person have an abortion. So vigilante justice, you know, in any form, is not the way to run a community. You know, we talk about the community. We always talk about how the community will, you know, we should leave this to the community. The community is not always, you know, peaceful, cooperative. The community can also be a vigilante gang. So, I mean, I tend to think of these things, you know, as political. That is, that we need to approach them in terms of the ways that we deal with each other, you know, in groups. I mean, of course, it's very important that we be able, person to person, to talk, to work things out. That's the microcosm. But we also need to think about these things politically. We need to think about policy. We need to think about, like, how do we get rid of the sex offender registry? You know, do we do it a little bit at a time? Do we only like aim to get rid of the whole thing all at once? I mean, those are tactical questions. But the aim has to be, you know, what is the world we want? You know, that has to be always, the vision always has to be in our minds. You know, whatever tactical choice we make, where are we going? You know, what is our vision? How do we get there? And people can disagree about how do we get there. But if you're just going kind of step by step and you don't have that vision, you know, people call it utopian, but we have to have utopias. We have to have some idea of what we really, really would want. You know, and it's not just an absence of violence, it's a presence of pleasure and pleasant, you know, a presence of love and of cooperation and of leisure and of decent food and, you know, and all of the things that, you know, that make life worth living. Getting rid of violence is just kind of step one to allow people to flourish. And I think I should end on that note.
Beautiful. Yep, that's beautiful. Now we see restorative justice has become kind of a buzzword. And in your book, you talk about the healing words that really need to be seen, and whether we call our work restorative justice, transformative justice, community accountability. And there are differences among them, but we need paradigm shifts from justice as retribution to justice as healing, from conviction to accountability, punishment to repair, and rehabilitation to transformation. Can you actually wrap up with just a little bit about what our audience needs to know about restorative justice?
I think you just said it. You know, I think that's those, you know, those sentences that you just read are a pretty good summary of what restorative justice is. It's changing the way we think about accountability and the way we think about what justice is.
my goal really is to have the deaf community really understand what restorative justice is and how justice can be healing. And I hope this interview helps to spark that discussion within our community.
And I would add that that book by Miriam Kaba and many things that she's written are really, really great to read, to understand what, not just what restorative justice is, but, you know, what is the context of it? You know, what is the philosophy? What is the spirit of it? You know, and what is what is the vision that it fits into of a kind of world that we could make?
Absolutely. And I do want to just share a little bit about my personal experience before we wrap up tonight. I am a person with a past sex offense. 34 years ago, I committed a sex harm. I'm now 46. You know my journey. You don't know the whole story though. The black and white words on paper don't define who I am today. And I refuse to live in the past. I'm tired of vigilantism from my own deaf community. Someone made the comment to me, you know, when people die and they bury you 6 feet under, a sex offender like him needs to be buried 12 feet under. Actually, it's better just to leave the body on the ground so the hungry animals can rip them up and eat them, make sure there's no trace of him. I wanted to share with you this letter. This is the first time I'm sharing this. This is from my mother, who just passed away 3 months ago. I was able to see her before she passed, and we went through some pictures and papers together. And this was a letter that she found that she had kept all these years. And reading this letter, I broke down. And, you know, I told my mom, when I tell people that I'm a sex offender and when I'm labeled this way, it hurts me, you know, deep in my soul. And she told me, it doesn't matter. I'm proud of you. That's restorative justice. You know, she was a victim too. She suffered too. And I look at this letter she wrote 25 years ago, and she has the language there of transformative justice. But the court chose a one-sided, ideologically dominated system and set me up for failure. But I want to share that letter with you. This was written in February 1996, 25 years ago. She wrote this to the judge overseeing my case. She says, "To the Honorable Judge, I'm writing in regards to Jason Tozier. I'm his mother. My name is Jody. And I've been trying to write this letter for a couple of weeks and have not been able to. First, I would like to just say that I love my son, Jason, more than words can say. When I was told what was happening to him, I was speechless. I can't tell you how much Jason has been through, and I know that doesn't make it right, what has happened, but I know that he's more than sorry and he regrets it immensely. We've had long discussions about it, but what has gotten me so upset is that I don't understand. You know, they've known for several years and couldn't help my son years ago instead of what's happening now. His father was in denial, but he also knew. I just can't see Jason being punished as an adult for something that happened so long ago when he was a child. I do believe he needs counseling, and I've been saying it for years. And I did get him into a program when I could 5 years ago, but the family didn't think he needed it, so they didn't help. Jason has a very hard time understanding that we love him no matter what has happened. He's not a predator or a threat to anyone, and everyone in the family is 100% behind him. Everybody makes mistakes in their life, as I'm sure you know. But what's important is that we learn from these mistakes. And by learning, that makes us the kind of people we are in life. In my opinion, Jason will benefit more from counseling than he will from being incarcerated and going to jail. Ask the people who know him, they'll tell you. Jason is a good and sensitive person, and we all love him. In closing, in my opinion, I think no one person is at fault. It's everybody's problem. I personally think the whole family needs counseling. Respectfully yours, Jody Denniston. And this has stuck with me, this attitude that my mom had. And this letter just really encapsulates that. This will haunt me forever, but it makes me stronger forever. And I'm proud to call her my mom. You know, recently in a few states, the highest court have agreed that the sex offender registry and its restrictions violate the 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and the 14th, which guarantees due process under law. So is the answer abolishing the sex offender registry? My last question to you, Judith, is what is your opinion on that?
Yes, I think that's the first thing we need to do. That's the very least we need to do. But I also just want to say that that was a beautiful letter that your mother wrote. Not every mother loves their son. Doesn't always come with the territory. And I'm so sorry that you lost your mother, but you are a lucky man to have had a person like that raise you.
I am, yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
I wish you
so
could have
much.
seen this interview. I know that she would have really been thrilled to meet you. So thank you again. Any other last thoughts as we wrap up?
No, I have nothing more to say, just to thank you and wish you the best of luck. And this has really inspired me even more to go out and learn American Sign Language. So thanks again. Take care.
Thank you and good night.